This is a tutorial on how to compute the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index using Stata. Basically, we will go through the to-do files we use to compute the WEAI. First, the data prep do file, which constructs our 10 indicators, and then the WEAI do file, which constructs the two sub-indices that compose the WEAI, the 5 domain of empowerment and the gender parity index. So starting with the data prep. We start with module B, more specifically with question B01. Based on question B01, we construct the indicator part act X. X refers to the activity, one of the activities listed in module B. So part act X is equal to 1 if the individual participates in activity X. It will be used later on as a filter variable. Then we aggregate part act X, the 6 part act X. When we construct the indicator part act. Part act gives me the number of activities in which the individual participates, in which the individual is involved. Then we also create part act agr, which gives me the number of agriculture activities in which the individual participates. Then, moving on, based on questions P02, we create the indicator input deck X. Input text X is equal to 1 if the individual participates in activity X and if he has input in some of the decisions regarding that activity. So the threshold is sum. The scale goes from input in no decisions to input in all decisions. The individual has to have at least input into some decisions to be considered adequate in this sub-indicator. Then we move, based on question P03, we create the indicator income deck X. Income deck X is equal to 1 if the individual participates in that activity and if he has some input in the decisions about income generated by that activity X. Then, moving to questions from module G, questions G01 and G02. First, based on question G01, we create the variable skip X. X again refers to type of decisions listed in module G. Skip X is equal to 1 if the individual is the person who actually makes the decision regarding that, makes that type of decisions in this household. Then we create fill make this X. Fill make this X is equal to 1 if skip X is equal to 1. That means fill make decision is equal to 1 if the individual actually makes the decision. And it's also equal to 1 if the individual participates in making the decision at a maximum or to a high extent. So the threshold, the cutoff for this indicator is at a medium extent. The scale goes so he participates not at all, small extent, medium extent, and to a high extent. So if the individual replies medium extent to high extent, or if he's the person who actually makes the decision, he will be assigned the number 1 in the indicator fill make decision of in activity X. Then we move on to aggregating these sub-indicators. So, first we create the indicator fill input test agg sum. Fill input test agg sum aggregates all the sub-indicators mentioned above related with decision making and agriculture. So it will give me the number of adequacies in relevant agriculture indicators. Which relevant indicators are there? Fill make this A to in type of decision A to E. which basically it's all the types of decision that are listed in Module G related with agriculture. Agriculture production, what inputs to buy for agriculture production, what types of crops to grow for agriculture production, when or who would take crops to the market, and livestock raising. And then for Module B, it's the activities 1, 2, 3, and 6. Namely, it's food crop farming, cash crop farming, livestock raising, and fishing. Then we create field input desk ag, which is our indicator of input in productive decisions. Field input desk ag is equal to 1. So that means the individual is considered adequate if there are at least 2 domains in which the individual has some input in decisions, or if it makes the decisions, or feels that it could make if he wanted to. So as long as there is 2 agricultural decision-making indicators in which the individual is considered adequate, you will have adequacy in terms of input in productive decisions. Now, in terms of income. So, similarly to above, we create an indicator income dash sum. Income dash sum aggregates adequacies in relevant indicators related with income decisions. So, as we aggregate all the sub-indicators that we created before, they are related with income decisions. And those are all indicators that we create income dash from 1 to 6. So it doesn't matter if it's agricultural activity, what matters is the question is about decision making about income generated. So all the 6 income dash X are aggregated. From Module G, we also consider the field make decision G and H, which refer to your own wage or salary, type of decision referred to wage or salary, and minor household expenditures, decisions about minor household expenditures. Then we create income dash count. Income dash count, which is our indicator, or the name in Stata for our indicator, control over use of income. So the individual is adequate in terms of control over use of income if there is at least one domain, one activity, one type of decision in which the individual has some input in income decisions, or feels she can make decisions of expenditure. So there is at least one of the indicators regarding income in which the individual is considered adequate. So that's the first line, income dash sum higher than 1. As long as that domain, if the only domain in which the individual has this input in decisions is regarding minor household expenditures. So that's the second line. If the individual has only input in one type of decision, and that type of decision is household expenditures, we don't consider that individual to be adequate in terms of control over use of income. Now we move on to questions G03 to G05. Please be aware that in your version of the questionnaire, these questions may have different names. The first thing we did in the pilot was to reverse the scale. However, for the newer versions of the questionnaire, the scale does not need to be reversed. So you can start by creating the relative autonomy index for type of decision X. This is the weighted sum of questions G03 to G05. This index varies between -9 and 9. Then we create the dummy variable, the dichotomous variable, high above X, that it's 1 if the relative autonomy index for activity regarding this type of decision X is higher than 1. Then we proceed to aggregation. We create the indicator RAI prod any. That it's our autonomy in it's our indicator of autonomy in production. WEAI prod any is equal to 1 if there is at least one of the activities linked with agriculture in which the individual has a high above relative autonomy index above 1. That indicator, the WEAI prod any, created that way, had a big number of missing values. So in order also to minimize the number of missing values, we considered adequate in terms of autonomy in production those individuals for whom there was missing information regarding the relative autonomy index, but in which we knew that they didn't participate in any of the agriculture activities listed in Module B. So that is the line that is now underlined. So for those with no information regarding the relative autonomy index and who did not participate in any of the four agriculture activities listed in Module B were considered adequate in terms of this indicator. Moving on to questions from Module C. First, based on C01, we create the indicator on X, where X refers to one of the type of assets listed in Module C. On X is equal to 1 if the household owns the type of asset X. Then we aggregate these indicators of ownership across assets, and we create own sum, which gives me the total number of type of assets that the household owns. This indicator varies between 0 and 14. And we create own ag sum, which gives me the number of type of agriculture assets the household owns. This indicator varies between 0 and 7. Then we move on to questions between C02 and C09. But although actually this doesn't include questions C07 and C08. First, based on C02, we create the indicator self-joint own X. The indicator self-joint own X is equal to 1 if the household owns that type of asset and the individual himself owns, at least jointly, that type of asset. Similarly, for question C04, based on C04, we create the indicator self-joint cell X, which is equal to 1 if the household owns the asset X and if the individual is the person who can, at least jointly, can decide on whether to sell the asset X or not. Similarly, we do the same with question C05, and we create the indicator self-joint give, C06, and we create the indicator self-joint rent, and C09, and we create the indicator self-joint buy, which is equal to 1 if the household owns the asset X and if the individual is, at least jointly, contributes to decisions regarding the purchase of the new unities of type asset X. Then we have here a first level aggregation that for each type of asset X we aggregate across rights. We create indicator self-joint right any X, which is equal to 1 if the individual has at least adequacy in one type of right, whether sell, give, rent, or buy, regarding type of asset X. Then we have some labeling that I will not go through here. And now we go to ownership. First, we create indicator self-joint X sum. Self-joint X sum, self-joint own sum gives me the total number of types of assets that the individual owns. Remember that we create the aggregate own sum, which gives me the total number of types of assets that the household owns. Here we are not looking to the household, but to individual, to the number of assets between of the 14 assets, types of assets listed, that individual actually owns, at least jointly. Then we create the J own count, and this is the name in Stata for our indicator of ownership. This indicator is equal to 1. That means the individual is considered adequate if his self-joint owns at least, the first line is at least one asset. If he owns at least one asset, that's what the line 282 defines. If at least one of the individual owns at least one of those 14 types of assets, is considered adequate. However, in the second line, if the individual only owns one type of asset and that asset is a small asset, is considered inadequate. How do we define small assets? We consider small assets chickens, when the individual said that the type of asset chickens, turkey or ducks, farm equipment, non-mechanized, and small consumer durables. So if the individual only owned one type of assets, and it was one of these three types of assets, then the individual is considered inadequate in terms of ownership. Other situation is also considered inadequate is if the household does not own any type of assets. So if he has a missing value here on the joint J own count, that the household does not own any type of assets, is also considered inadequate. It's attributed at 0. Then we move on to the rights. If you remember above, we create right any X, which was one if the individual had at least one type of right regarding the type of asset X. Now we aggregate that indicator, the right any, across assets. However, here one thing that I would like to point out is, like in ownership, we consider the 14 types of assets, all types of assets. We were looking to the ownership of assets. Here in rights, we are only focusing on agricultural types of assets. So only considers agricultural assets. The first thing we create is self-joint right any aggregate sum, which gives me the number of agricultural assets the individual has at least one right, regarding which the individual has at least one right. And the agricultural assets are the ones listed as B to G. Then we create self-joint right any aggregate count. That is the name that we give here to our indicator of purchase, sale, or transfer of assets, although later we rename it, we shorten the name so it will be easier to run the next two files. But so for now, this indicator of purchase, sale, or transfer of assets, it's equal to 1, so the individual is considered adequate if there is at least one asset, one agriculture asset, in which he has at least one type of right. That's what this line, the 298 line, defines. However, similarly to the indicator of ownership, if there is only one asset in which the individual has at least one type of right, and that asset is a small asset, we still consider the individual as inadequate. What are the small assets here? It's chickens and turkeys and farm equipment non-mechanized. It's the two agriculture assets. But if the individual has only one agriculture asset and it's one of these two assets, we still consider them inadequate in terms of purchase, sale, or transfer of assets. Then, also, if the individual lives in a household where there are no agricultural types of assets, we also consider him inadequate. Moving on to questions regarding credit. Based on question C10, we construct indicator credit access X. X refers to one of the sources of credit listed in these questions. Credit access X is equal to 1 if the household has used the source of credit X in the past 12 months. Then we aggregate credit access across that sources of credit, and we create the indicator credit access, which gives me the number of sources of credit that the household used in the past 12 months. Then, based on question C11, we create the indicator credit self-joint borrow Y. Here Y refers to the source of credit. Credit self-joint borrow Y is equal to 1 if the household used the source of credit Y, not X, and the individual has at least jointly the right to borrow from that source of credit. We do the same for the decision of how to use the credit from that source. We create credit self-joint use, which is equal to 1 if the household has used the source of credit Y and the individual makes, at least jointly, the decisions about how to use credit from that source. Then we do a first level aggregation. What do I mean? We create credit self-joint any dash Y, which we aggregate across the rights for each source of credit Y. This indicator is equal to 1 if the individual, at least jointly, makes one of the two decisions, whether to borrow or how to use the credit from source Y. Some labeling, and then we move on to the second level aggregation. In the second level of aggregation, so we create the indicator credit self-joint any decision any. This indicator is equal to 1, that means it considers the individual adequate if the individual makes at least one of the decisions regarding at least one source of credit. However, if the household has not used any source of credit, then the individual is considered inadequate in terms of access to and decisions on credit. Moving on to questions from Module E. Based on E02, we create the indicator speak public X, where X refers to a reason for which the individual would speak in public. Speak in public X is equal to 1 if the individual feels comfortable speaking in public, even if with difficulty, for reason X. Then we aggregate and we create the indicator speak public any, which is equal to 1 if there is at least one, if for at least one of the three reasons included in the questionnaire, the individual feels comfortable speaking in public. Then, based on E07, we create the indicator group member X, where X refers to one type of group. Group member X is equal to 1 if the individual is an active member of group X. Then we aggregate across types of groups, and we create group member any, which is our indicator of group membership. This indicator is equal to 1 if the individual is an active member of at least one group. Moving on to question F04. Based on that question, we create the indicator leisure time. Leisure time is equal to 1 if in a scale of 1, where 1 is not satisfied, to 10, where 10 is very satisfied, the individual places her level of satisfaction about pleasure above 4. That means if the individual is indifferent or satisfied about her leisure time. Now we are only missing the indicator workload. To create this indicator, we use the dataset with information regarding the individual's time allocation. In this dataset, each line corresponds to the answers of individual E regarding activity J. The first thing we did we opted for not dropping the respondents who reported that their reference day was a non-working day. We did not do that because that would imply a large number of missing values. Then we define the working activities. As working activities, we included work as employed, own business work, farming, construction, fishing, shopping or getting service, weaving, sewing, textile care, cooking, domestic work, care for children, commuting, and traveling. Then we create a variable that gives me the total time spent on working activities. So we define work as the sum of the time spent in working in one of those activities as primary activity plus 50% of the time spent in those activities as secondary activities. Then we defined poverty lines. We defined 4 poverty lines, but the one that we actually use for the indicator we consider in the WEAI is the 10.5. It's 10.5 hours a day. After creating the poverty lines, we identified the pool. For each poverty line we create a variable poor x, which is equal to 1 if the individual has worked more than the cutoff x. The code includes other commands to provide statistics regarding time poverty at the country level, but the variable that we really want is the poor x. Then we merge all this poor x with our indicators, with our initial indicators that we created before, but as all our previous indicators are defined in terms of adequacy, define them as 1 if the individual is adequate. We also, instead of using poor 10.5, that is our cutoff z, we create n poor, which gives me the individuals that are not poor in terms of time when I consider the cutoff z. And with this finishes our data prep do file. By the end of this do file, we have a data set with all the indicators we need to construct the WEAI, but defined in terms of adequacy. So all indicators are defined so that 1 means that the individual is adequate in terms of that indicator. Now we will go through the WEAI do file. The first part of the do file WEAI is dedicated to the construction of the Index 5 Domains of Empowerment, the 5DE. Although our final goal is a measure of empowerment, we begin by focusing on disempowerment and computing 1 minus 5DE. The first thing we do is to transform all our indicators of adequacy into inadequacy ones. So now our inadequacy indicators will be 1 if the individual is considered inadequate in that specific indicator. Then we construct a loop for each country. Then we create a local variable with all indicators, and we define the sample, which is the number of individuals for whom there is no missing values in any of the indicators considered. Then we create the weights of each indicator, the indicator's weights. Then we define the weighted inadequacy G03 matrix. Each weight G0 variable corresponds to a column of the matrix. Then we compute the frequency of missing values for indicator. Finally, we defined the weighted inadequacy count vector, CI. CI gives me the individual's inadequacy count. Varies between 0 and 1. Gives me the weighted number of inadequacies that the individual has. And here we check the sample drop due to missing values. How many individuals are we missing? For how many individuals do we not have the CI? Here we compute the National Disempowerment Index, the WEAI. Remember that this is national, so this includes men and women. So for each possible cutoff between 1% and 100%, we create a variable that identifies the disempowered individuals, those who have an inadequacy score higher than X%. Then we compute the individual inadequacy score of those who are disempowered, the average inadequacy score of the disempowered. We compute the disempowerment index, the WEAI, the disempowerment in agriculture index for the country, for a full sample of men and women. By difference, we get the empowerment in agriculture index for the country. We compute the raw head counts at the country level. Here we define the local cutoff of the 20%, which is the cutoff that we use for the WEAI, and the subgroup gender. So we're going to start analyzing things by gender, because in the end we are focusing on women only. In these lines, we compute the censored head counts at country level. In these lines, we maintain a register of the sample drop by gender. Finally, we save our first set of results by country. Remember that C refers to the country. For each country, we have the results for each by individual. The inadequacy count, the variable that identifies the disempower for each of the cutoffs, and the value of the disempowerment in agriculture index and the empowerment in agriculture index for each cutoff. Here we have the same variables but by gender. We collapse individual results by gender. So we have the disempowered head count, the average inadequacy score, the censored head count, and the raw head count, but for men and for women. And here we compute the disempowerment index similarly to what we did above, but by gender. And these lines give me the contribution, compute each gender contribution to the national disempowerment index. With line 278, we save the second set of results, and this set of results has all the information but by gender. From here, when we have this data set, we need to extract the relevant information. So we need to extract the information to build the tables. And that's on these next lines. So browse H20P, A20P, M020P, EA20P if gender equals 2. This gives me the disempowerment head count for the cutoff 20, the average inadequacy share A20, the 5 domains disempowerment index which here we call M020P, and finally the 5 domains empowerment index which here is called the EA20P if gender is equal to means for women. Other thing that we also would like to have, it's the censored head counts for each indicator. So browse, this command now gives me for the 10 indicators the censored head counts for a sample of women. And also the contribution, the indicator's contribution for disempowered for women. This is given by this next command. If we replace the gender equals 2 by gender equal 1, we obtain the same set of results, but for men. So here finish the part of the do file that refers to 5DE. Moving on to the computation of the gender parity index. So first thing, we use the data set that already has all the indicators in their inadequacy form. Then we drop the female only households. To compute the GPI, we need the households where there is both a primary male and a primary female, and both we have information regarding the two. Then the first steps of the computation of the GPI of gender parity index are identical to the first steps of the computation of the 5 domains of empowerment. First, we create the local variables with all indicators. Second, we define the weights of all the indicators. Then we create the weighted inadequacy matrix. Then we computed the inadequacy count. Until here it was identical to what we have done above. Then we create the variables that gives me the inadequacy count of the primary male and primary female in the household. Then we censor those inadequacy counts at 0.2. So for instance, we replace the primary women in the household inadequacy count by 0.2 if our inadequacy count is below 0.2. The same for men. For the case of Guatemala, where there was a massive number of missing observations, to avoid the drop of observations, we imputed the average male inadequacy count to the missing values. Unfortunately, this only allowed us to recover 15 women observations. Then we create a variable that identifies the households where there is no gender parity. That variable is CI above, which is equal to 1 if the primary women inadequacy censored count is higher than the inadequacy count of the primary male, which means that the woman has a higher disempowerment than the male living in the same household. Then we create a variable that identifies our sample of women, so our sample of women for whom we have information regarding the primary man and the primary woman in the household. Say above gives 1 for the households where there is no gender parity. Here we create a variable inadequate, which is only for women. So it's equal to 1 if the respondent is a woman and lives in a household without gender parity. Then we computed the total number of women that live in households without gender parity by country, and we create also the proportion. So it gives me the proportion of women in that country, of our sample, that live in households without gender parity. Then we compute the normalized gap. The normalized gap between the women's censored inadequacy count and the men's censored inadequacy count. Then by country, we compute the average gap. Finally, we have all that we need to compute the GPI. First, we have the head count of the GPI, which is the percentage of women that live in households without gender parity. Then we compute this PI, which is equal to that proportion of women multiplied by the average gap between the inadequacy count of women and men. With this, we can obtain the GPI, the gender parity index. So then we can do some tabulations to have the final results. Now, we have all the elements we need to compute the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture index. Please remember that this index is equal to 0.9 multiplied by the 5DE plus 0.1 multiplied by the GPI. I hope this session was helpful. If you have any doubts, please do not hesitate to contact us.